everybody. I'm Pastor AJ Houseman, and welcome to 10 Foot Pole, a podcast to dig deeper into aspects of the Bible that get glossed over or totally ignored in most preaching. The Bible has a lot of parts that are racy, uncomfortable, and sometimes downright horrifying. Let's talk about it. Welcome to Season 2, Episode 11. Our guest is Pastor Drew Tucker, who is the university pastor at Capital University in Columbus, Ohio.
That is welcome. Where I am. Thank you.
Well, welcome. We're having two ELCA college pastors back to back. I didn't even do that on purpose. So,
who am I following, or who's coming next?
You are following Melissa Whipple, who's at Bethany in Kansas. So. New pastor down there.
That's pretty right. Exciting. Excellent. Mm-hmm.
Pastor good. Drew just wrote a book last year. I'm sure it took you more than a year to write it, but it was published. Please,
it was.
Your book for you. Tell us about it. Tell us about your book.
So my book is a labor of love during the pandemic. I, like many of us, was staring at my computer in April of 2020 and said, what am I going to do now? Some of us, like you, started podcasts. I said, why not throw out book proposals and see if anyone responds? And then someone actually did. So that meant I had responsibilities, which was a thing. But I wrote a book. It's called 4D Formation, Exploring Vocation in Community. It's all about figuring out what we are called to do and differentiating that from our identities.
Individually or collectively?
Both. Right. So there are tools in there that are supposed to be helpful, ideally helpful for individuals doing their process of figuring out what kind of citizen they're called to be, what kind of jobs they're called to do, what kind of relationships they want to have, but also are helpful for churches figuring out what kinds of community commitments they want to make, or for individual families to figure out what is it that their priorities are going to be for the next 10 years. Right. These are the kinds of things that I hope are helpful out of it. It comes out of 10 years or more working in campus ministry. So lots of work with young adults thinking through who they are and what they want to do with that. But the biggest, I think, gift of it for me was that it made me think about the differentiation between identity and vocation.
Yeah.
So I am not what I do.
Yeah.
I am a person who happens to be a pastor, a husband, a U.S. citizen, all of these kinds of things. But being very clear that if one of those things ends, if I stop being a pastor tomorrow, I don't lose myself, that God still loves me and finds me in my identity because God made me long before I did any of those things. So holding that in intention has been something that's been helpful for me, and I hope has been helpful for readers so far.
Yeah, that sounds like a great book, and I thank you for sharing that with our audience. Is there a particular, may I ask, like a particular target audience that you're aiming for? Is it mostly for those in like college, or those in churches, or anybody who's really kind of like, wow, I'd like to, sort out some of my life?
Yeah, so it's really designed for anybody. One of the things that I found in campus ministry is that I work with religious people of all different kinds of religions, and also people that aren't at all religious. So one of the things that I intentionally do is try to draw on examples from different religious traditions. So it's not just drawing on Christian imagery, not just drawing on Christian examples. I happen to be a Christian, so that's there for sure.
Yeah.
But there's lots of other evidence of lots of other thinkers and traditions and reflections in there. And it's not just for college students or even high school students, although that's the kind of initial audience. It's really for anyone who's looking to figure out what they are about right now. Anyone who's maybe in a life transition, changing jobs, or has had a difficult experience in a relationship, has had a giant move and everything seems like it should be wonderful, but they're feeling out of place, right? These are the kinds of things that thinking about vocation and how it relates to your identity, this kind of resource can be a helpful companion to people in many parts of those journeys from many different traditions.
Nice. Yeah, it sounds pretty great. Links to that will be in the show notes, so you guys can check out Pastor Drew's book there. Thanks for sharing that.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah. Well, listen, this is why I have, cool pastors on my podcast, so that you can share cool things that I think are just, great things for great resources, right?
Well, thanks.
For people to continue their own faith journey and learning. And that's very much a part of that is focus on identity.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that I love about the idea of your podcast, the target audience, this reality that we are not confined or constrained by the traditions that we either grew up in or that we might still identify with today, because I have learned so much more about my own spirituality by engaging people whose spiritualities are so vastly different than mine own. And it's been such a gift. I learned more about being a good pastor from one of my friends who's an imam than I did from some of my pastoral mentors, right? It was that level of being willing to listen to someone else who didn't do things the way I was trained. And I realized there are other ways to be that are also holy, that are also beautiful and sacred.
Yeah, so that's actually, I'll say for myself, that's actually a part of sort of my my faith journey and my call story. When I was in high school, I was invited to go to it was still a Christian church, but a very different kind of Christian church than the one that I grew up in, their youth group, and would go to their youth group things and their Bible study and sometimes their worship services. In no way, like, this was like just going with friends in addition to like still being involved in my own community. And I remember always like coming home from those and having conversations like with my mom, like my mom would be like, well, what'd you guys talk about? And then, and we talk about it. She's like, what do you think of that? And there was like things that like, I would be like, well, I don't know if I agree with that, and to be able to then sort of more strongly form my own faith, I think, in somewhat in contrast to some of the other things that, like, because I think sometimes when you just go to one church your whole life, right, like, you don't necessarily have your formed faith in a way of why yours is distinct from, any other kind of Christian or any other person, right? Like being able to actually articulate what you believe and why. That was so part of my faith journey. So I appreciate that too.
Nice.
All right, let's get into some Bible talk. So
yes.
Pastor Drew and I are gonna dive into Deuteronomy. So this is I think this is a new book for us to talk about on the podcast. So we'll do a little bit of just a teeny bit of background. If you listen to episode 10, you're going to hear some more background just on the beginning of the Bible and the Pentateuch, these or Torah, these first 5 books of the Bible. So go back and listen to episode 10 if you didn't and, have time. But we're going to talk about Deuteronomy. And so we're specifically going to talk about something towards the end of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 20. For those of you who plan on going to church on Sunday, February 12th, you're going to hear this as a part of that. I'm going to read it here from the New Revised Standard Version, Updated Edition. See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity. If you obey the commandments of the Lord your God that I am commanding you today, by loving the Lord your God, walking in God's ways, and observing God's commandments, decrees, and ordinances, then you shall live and become numerous, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land that you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away, and you do not hear but are led astray to bow down to other gods and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall certainly perish. You shall not live long in the land that you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants may live, loving the Lord your God, obeying God, and holding fast to God, for that means life to you and length of days, so that you may live in the land that the Lord swore to give your ancestors, to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Also, that's a toughie.
It is. This is why I wanted to talk about it today. I think this, puts us in a place that I think so I say that, like, whenever I do like sort of like a Bible study, I always say that I spend one day on the big questions. I teach class too. The big questions, the theodicy type of questions. And I think, what you and I briefly discussed before we started recording and what I think we're going to get into today touches on the big questions, the big overarching questions that I think every human asks to somebody at some point in time. Right. But first I just want to point out just a little, just a little Bible study notes to go with this. So this is the end of Deuteronomy. So we talked about in episode 10, sort of the Pentateuch is typically what Christians call the first 5 books of the Bible. In Judaism, it's called the Torah, which is the law or the teachings. And this is the end, right? So this is the last. This is the very end. This is the part where they're just about to enter into the promised land. They come out of slavery. They've wandered for forever. Moses is given a final speech, and then they're going to go in. And so the Deuteronomy is often considered sort of like a preached law, because there's a lot of rules, right, that are talked about, but the beginning of it, like chapters 1 to 11 are really like a sermon, and then 12 to 26 is a list of a lot of rules, and then the 27 to 28 is these lists of curses and blessings, and then this last part here from 29 to the end in 34 is sort of the narration of Moses's final words. It kind of acts like an appendix, right? Like it's the final words kind of gluing everything together. And then Moses dies, and it's then the narration of his death and burial, because he doesn't get to go into the promised land. That they do that without him. So that's kind of what's happening here at the end of this beginning chunk.
Can I throw one other thing that I have just recently been obsessed with about Deuteronomy and the origins of Israel? So I love podcasts. So not only do I love religious podcasts, but I also love history podcasts. Yeah. And I've been listening to a lot recently about the late Bronze Age collapse, which is this time in the ancient Near East, in this side of the Mediterranean that Israel-Palestine is on, when basically within 100 years, every major civilization there either fell apart or majorly contracted. So Egypt at this time falls into a much smaller area. Assyria at this time falls into a much smaller area. Mycenae in Greece is demolished, right? This is also the time that the Israelites are leaving Egypt. So it's within this context of their moving that the whole world is falling apart. And so that piece of promise and blessing that comes out here in Deuteronomy that really appears throughout the law is in a kind of apocalyptic context for the whole world at that time. And I just, having found that, I've read the Bible differently just in the last couple of months, knowing that piece of history.
Yeah, that's a beautiful context. Thank you for adding that to the conversation. I agree, because it really does put into, if you think about everyone around them is really struggling in sort of, a recession type economy situation, maybe famine, some wars and stuff. It would be very, very, pertinent to hear, your God, your divine say, I'm going to take care of you and bless you in these ways. That's a huge deal.
Yeah. I never expected random podcasts for my commutes to become some of the best continuing education I've had, but they've been some of the best continuing education I've had.
Listen, you're just sort of, adding to your own growth that way. And that's why I think podcasts are great, but I'm slightly biased on that front.
Yeah. And that's why, even though this isn't my podcast, I will tell you, listeners, you should share this podcast with someone that you know and love. That's what you should do.
Good. Thanks.
You're welcome.
So getting into this, into this part of the Deuteronomy here, so we have this very verse 15 just really kind of like smacks you in the face here. And I actually, so this this life and prosperity and death and adversity dichotomy that they're setting up, I read quite a few things that like prosperity and adversity are not the best translations here.
Mm-hmm.
That it's really just life and good and death and evil. And the reason why is those words there. So the word that's good here, we have life and good together. The word here for good is the same word that when in Genesis, when God made the trees and said it was good, and God made different things in creation and it was good. So it's that same word there. So that's important. And then the same with the evil here gets pitted against where did I do with that? It's the same one that we have in the beginning of Genesis of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil of what this is. So that one might be, I think evil is kind of a vague word, and how we define evil, or some here gets translated as wicked.
Yeah, I think evil, I was a philosophy major in undergrad, so there's always a danger in terms of talking about definitions of words and all of that kind of stuff that I get way off track. So I apologize if we end up there. But
no, I do the same thing.
I think evil is one of those things that only exists because we have a concept of good, or a concept of right, or a concept of something as the way it should be.
Yeah.
And so our definition of evil is often dependent on our definition of, well, what is it that should be? And that's one of the reasons why it feels to me amorphous, because like what should be for you is not necessarily what should be for me. And so evil will function differently in our lives, because what might be bad for you could be good for me in some real substantive, physical or mental or emotional or spiritual ways.
Yeah. Yeah, I appreciate that. That's good. And I think that helps very much frame then what sort of this thing that God is presenting them with, right? So or that Moses is presenting them with on behalf of God, of this choice. Really. It's like this it's giving them this agency. Here are your choices. How do we feel about them? Or is it a choice? I don't know sometimes.
Right? That's because it's not the same kind of choice that we have when we go to the grocery store. Like, what of these 38 different kinds of pasta do I want? Right? Like that's choice in the kind of classic North American capitalist sense of choice. The kind of choice here is much more fundamental in terms of like, do you want to thrive or not? Right? Well, of course I want to thrive, but that means then there are a lot of other associated factors, a lot of other behaviors, a lot of other, if I had just written a book on vocation, I might say a lot of other work or vocation that we have to do in order to do that. Right. So this kind of choice feels a bit false to me when I read this. It doesn't seem like it's much of an option. It's like, hey, do you want to die or live? Like, I would prefer to live. That seems like the better way to be.
Yeah, it's definitely not framed as, I don't know. It's not framed as like a real choice. I'm trying to think of a good example, because I feel like this is like, you hear, I mean, these are the kind of choices that you hear about all the time where there's not really a choice. I think about maybe, I'm not sure if this is a good example or not, but maybe someone who is on trial for something and, and taking a plea bargain. And it's sort of like, well, here's choice A, right? Like, you could say these things and then you'll just have a little bit of time and then it's community service and then it'll be totally fine. Or this other thing that you can do and like, you're in jail forever. It's like, well, obviously, like, and so people make deals and stuff like that to get that. That's just how it feels to me, is like kind of like a shady It shouldn't, right? Like if this is the promises of God shouldn't come off as like this shady deal, right?
But I totally hear that.
Because
one
it's
of
a deal, right? It's not like a, hey, I just automatically promise you all of these things.
Right. And I think, if I were trying to read this in a very kind of literalist or flat reading, I would say, well, what do you mean? God promises them to us, but it's a dependent promise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Gifts are not dependent promises. Gifts are leased, they are freely offered, and then we do with them what we will. So it's not the same thing. We can rationalize our way into saying, well, no, it is a gift, but gifts that have effectively burn after reading kind of consequences, like that's not a gift. That's something else.
Yeah.
But I also think that like life has some of those things that we've agreed to. Like, I mean, I know that if I don't drink water, I will eventually dehydrate. And if I dehydrate, I will eventually no longer exist, right? Like there are some of these things that I have choices in, but they're not really a choice if I want to continue to survive.
That's true.
But
well, maybe look at it that way. Like this is a survival, if it's not really a choice, right? If this is if you're thinking about an instinct of survival, which is very much honestly where they're at, standing, in Moab, right outside the promised land. All they have to do is cross the river, or stay in the desert. Like that feels like a survivor kind of choice, right? Like those are those instinctual, yes, of course, I'm going to choose this type of thing.
And that's the context of Israel to this point, the context of this sort of world changing time period in these late 12 or 1100s, right? Is just the world that we knew is no longer functioning. So we can hold on to that, or we can claim a new way to be that will allow us to live and thrive.
Yeah. That's a good one.
It's too bad we can't look around at our like politics or religions or anything and say the world that we knew is no longer functioning this way. Maybe we should change things.
Yeah. I also think for them to like where they're at, and maybe a thing for us to also read into this is sort of when you think about that survival mode type of thing, that like that insinuation that like your relationship with God isn't a choice so much as it is for survival. That it is a part of, it's like drinking water, right? It's a part of who we are in order to exist. Just a really sermon-y kind of thought there.
It's beautiful though. It hit me.
Good, glad. I hope it hit someone else. But one of the things that then they're presented with is this idea of blessings and curses. And this idea is very deep-seatedly rooted in not only, Christianity, Judaism. It's sort of, I think, honestly, there's some roots to it in every single religion, because I think that's how we kind of measure our moral code, right? That like there has to be consequences for the bad and there is reward for the good. That I really think every religion has set up this different moral code to kind of go along with those, whether you call it karma, that's one word that gets used for it, or say you move into enlightenment, or then like you move backwards in the next life if it the tally is not right. Like these are these concepts and ideas that are prevalent in most cultures and throughout all of time. And so this is sort of ours to wrestle with, blessings and curses.
I'm so glad you invited me on for the nice, simple conversation on the pod. It really is. One of the words that you use that I think is so important is consequence, because often I struggle with the idea of curse as punishment, right? Like the God that I know, understand, believe, worship, have relationship with doesn't take joy in our suffering, doesn't seek to crush us underfoot, doesn't want us to die. And also, there are reactions in the world to the ways in which we live. There are consequences. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things that I struggle to see in much of the Bible is, where is there this kind of human penchant for punishment at play, and where is there the natural order of consequence? And what's the difference there? I don't think that difference is easy to suss out in this particular passage, because it's very much on the spiritual end of things. But I think even the idea of bowing to other gods, as one of the translations says for this, it tells us something about, if I put my focus elsewhere over and over and over again, the consequence of that will be that my focus is more absorbed elsewhere than on God. The priorities that I have will be shaped by that focus. And now that could be a very fine thing, or it could be a very destructive thing, or it could be a generally neutral thing. But whatever that thing is, it will begin to shape me because I spend so much time with it. And that, I think, is the kind of difference between consequence and punishment, is that that's not the world punishing me. It's not the universe seeking to give me my just desserts, but it's the natural order of, you're going to form a habit if you focus on anything. And that's different, but that's not a curse. And that's not exactly what this passage is talking about either.
Right. Which is a good thing to note. So there is a type of Christianity that, at least from the outside in, we label as prosperity gospel, with this sort of idea that, like, obviously, if you are good and whatever, you're going to be given. That's the word I'm trying to find. Given these kind of blessings. And if you're bad, then you're cursed. So the idea is that, like, if you are someone who is rich and makes lots of money, clearly you're doing something right. You're a great, amazing person, and that God is blessing you for that. And then, on the other side, if you're poor, clearly God's punishing you. That this idea comes out of this. My listeners probably cannot hear Pastor Drew rolling his eyes. Can you put that into words?
It just grieves me, and not because it's not attractive, right? I'm a middle-class white guy, right? Like, on the one hand, I should be fine with all this because, like, I'm more blessed than cursed. But the flip side of that is, it's just so patently
manipulative,
unbiblical, right? Manipulative, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, anti-Christ. It is, if we try to apply that to the life of Jesus and we look at the people that he spent his time with blessing, like, it just doesn't map. It doesn't map onto the life of Jesus. And it makes me mad. There's a theologian out there named Kate Bowler, who actually was an academic to do research on the prosperity gospel as a movement in North America. And then, pertinent to some conversations that we were having about friends and family earlier, after her first book was published and she got tenure at Duke University, she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. As a prosperity gospel expert, right? It's everywhere. And Kate was one of my professors at Duke while I was there at Div School. And she wrote a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies That I've Loved. And that's what really grieves me about it. We'll put that book in the show notes
too, because that sounds like a really good book that I would like to check out.
It's one of those books that I read in like an hour and a half or two, because it was just so I couldn't put it down. But her point there is, all of us have a tendency towards some of this kind of prosperity blessing. And we think our lives are built on this just desert. And then things are so obviously unjust. And we have to wrestle with the lies that we have loved, and then let them go and find what is really going on, what is really our lives right now. So yeah, that's why my eye roll was so loud in your microphone, headphones.
Well, whatever. No, because I think so. This is where all of this falls apart when you put any sort of, stake into it that, like, clearly if, you know, good things are happening in your life, that God is blessing you, and clearly if bad things are happening in your life, it is God is cursing you. When you look at it directly, like, this is why I say this really touches on one of those big life questions, right? Because, you know, it doesn't seem to add up. Like, why some of these, why some people can be absolutely horrible people, take advantage of others, assault others, mistreat people, say horrible things, and still apparently fall into this being blessed category. Whereas someone that can be good and kind and giving and caring can get cancer so young. And that's why this is the big life question. The amount of times that I've had conversations with people, in the hospital, or family members, or, just other parishioners, about trying to make it all make sense, because it doesn't, right? Like, we can't make sense of, like, why did that person have to die? When you try to put that into these terms. And this is where I think, some of this language can get really toxic in how it lives out and plays in our society and in our own lives, because, when, this can talk all day about, oh, they're blessed, they're great, they're whatever. And then as soon as something bad happens, our entire system of what we think of, like, this grounding root that, like, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people, falls apart instantly. And so how do we wrestle with that, and where do you come out with your answer on the other side? That, I think, is I'm not asking you directly, like, you need to answer that for everyone.
Thank God.
But I think that's, so I told this broad category of these big questions, right? Because I think these are the big questions that define where we go in our faith journeys, is how we try to find answers to those.
Absolutely. I one of the ways that I have found comfort in asking those big questions is not asking them alone. Often I find myself, if I ask myself those questions and I just stew on them in my mind, I find myself to despair pretty quickly. But if there's someone on the other end of a Zoom call, or someone else in the room who I know can hold gently these questions, these challenges, these fears, these concerns, they may not have answers.
Yeah.
But they have a strength to hold it while I need to share it for a minute. I think my greatest gift and biggest continual challenge as a pastor is being able to hold those things with people, because it's sometimes they're my questions too. And what they don't need is me becoming the center of attention.
Yeah.
But they also can really appreciate some true empathy, some true realization that they're not alone in this question. And so that's ministry, right? Like, it's not magic hands.
That's the pastoral care piece. I actually think that's one of the biggest callings in what it means to be called to be a pastor, is to be able to sit with people in those things, and not to just explain them away or hold them, right? Like, they're coming for a deep emotional and existential place, right? And I could spout off Bible justifications and theological, it doesn't, I don't think that it's not, your job's not to fix, right? Our job is to sit in the muck with people,
Right.
because this seems to only be a problem when things aren't going well. There's when life isn't, the black and white peachy keen that you want it to be, that it's all of a sudden it's like, oh, this breaks down. Which is, I always tell people on the podcast and encourage them to understand that, like, the Bible is not black and white. Life is not black and white. Life is one big gray area. And how we understand and navigate that is, how you define what you think loving others and loving God is.
Right.
And striving to do those things.
Yes. And striving, right? I think there's a beautiful, what I would call condescension here, but I want to be clear, I don't mean condescending in a negative way. I mean, the idea of condescension is that you come down to be with, right? Mm-hmm. So that you are kind of like the word Emmanuel, God with us, and in the Christmas story, condescension in its more neutral term is you choose to go down to be with someone somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so on perhaps a more, I don't know if this is putting too much into the mind of God, but the way that I read this in a more empathetic way is that God knows we are looking for simple black and white answers. Mm. God knows that we are looking for, this is the thing you do, this is the thing you don't do. And so there's times in the Bible where we get this, right? Like, all right, fine. What do you want? Here are the ways that you choose life. Here are the 10 commandments. Here are the do unto others as you would have done unto you. Mm-hmm. And then we get all of the times in the Bible when people don't do it right. Like Moses, the one who's giving all of this here at the end of Deuteronomy, and then doesn't actually get to go into the promised land, and yet is still beloved by God. Like the disciples who follow Jesus until they don't, and yet are still beloved by God. That reality of, yes, I know you want black and white. So here's the ideal. Yeah, if you could do everything this way, great.
Yeah. But
when you don't, because you won't,
right,
I will still be there too. And that's the hope, the beauty that comes through these and other passages like it.
And we'll work through those things as they come.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, for sure. I think that you also kind of get that even still just within the Torah itself, right? Like, Absolutely. Sort of, here are your 10 commandments, right? These are the, 10 things, which that's even, let's even back up even further from that's too far ahead. We need to back up even to, just the very simple contractual arrangement, between the first two humans, or the contractual arrangement after the flood, or the contractual arrangement in the sevenfold promise of Abraham, where, these are, God kind of builds these covenants to say, because it's not going to be perfect, right? Like, this is ideally how it would go. And when it doesn't, this is why we have this. And then, so it just kind of keeps building, right? And then you have the 10 commandments. Here's what I'd like you to do. And then, there's some crazy amount of rules. There's like, I have 500, 600, some different rules to go with it too. That actually creates up the total of the mitzvot. So mitzvah is like commandment, but like that's not a great translation. So most Jewish Bibles won't translate it because it's more than just the like singular commandment, because it's a way of living is what is really what it is. Like, this is the agreement, this way that God would like you to live is in essence, I think, what that's best, kind of translated, because there's a bunch of don't do's, but there are actually more please do this listed in these regulations. Please honor these people. Please take care of foreigners when they come into your land. Take care of these people. There's more of do these things than there is don't do these things in this mitzvot, in this, the way that God wants you to live. And that's actually, so that word is in verse 16 there, where I think most English versions would say observe God's commandments, that it would be this mitzvot, observe this way that God would like you to live. That's what is the life-giving part. To choose life means choosing to enter into this way of this life-giving, I think both individually, but also as a community. And that may be the bigger piece of it, really. As we talk about things like the prosperity gospel and stuff, really like to focus on your own individualism, your own individual salvation, your individual blessings. But really, you have to remember that this is plural, being spoken to a group. It's the same when Jesus talks too. It's a you all situation. It's a y'all. It's not a one person. God is not counting your individual blessings, but rather, or your individual whatever. It's a community. They've heard this many times, but I'm going to repeat it anyways. When we hear in John 3:16 and 17 that like God so loved the world, what's the whole cosmos?
Yeah.
It's not God loved you and gave you this. It is the whole creation that is being saved and sanctified together, not individually. So what collectively would choosing life look like?
Yeah.
And do we? That's actually a better question, because I could make some very Drew's like, absolutely.
No, we do not.
Do we collectively as a society choose life, choose to live into this mitzvot the way that God would like us to live? No, I would say as well that is not something that we particularly excel at.
Well, even just look at the ways that we've structured our groceries, that we have an overabundance of food available in the world to satisfy the choices, the desires that we have. And by we right there, I mean people with some level of means, some level of economic access.
Yeah.
And there are other people who starve. And physical access, right? Like we have the transportation, we have the proximity, we have those kinds of things. We have the chance to choose life quite literally for people, and we often do not. And that's the very end of the passage points to that.
I want to pause you right there, though. I pause you right there and talk about that just kind of really kind of echo in that, or maybe nail it in a little further, to understand that like we make life or death choices for other people.
Oh, absolutely. And we're not invited to, right? We are often making them at their expense.
Yeah. We've talked about that too, about sort of the idea of corporate and structural sins, and how what those things that we do adversely affect others.
Right. Right. One of my friends from seminary was in a band called Pacific Gyre because they liked to be funny punk rock kids, and because it was a commentary. Exactly right. So yes, there's so many stories I could tell, but I just always laughed at that, because it was this, we're claiming the name of the trash heap that is currently wreaking havoc in the most beautiful, expansive place left on the planet, because we can't keep our consumption in check. That's who we are. But that's the community element, that piece of we are making these choices. And Moses here at the end, calling back to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, to your forebears, that this is a promise that's not just for you. This is a promise that existed before you were here.
Yeah.
And by that logic, this is a promise that will exist long after you're gone. So why are you so isolated in your acceptance and or participation or not in this promise? Why are you so isolated? Why aren't you in that community, caring about deciding for life in that community?
Yeah. How does that put in perspective for us too? Right? That choose life so that you and your descendants may live. I think about this a lot. So I have my daughter actually just turned 2 days ago.
That's awesome.
So what it is to have like, what worlds, what society, what relationships are we building or destroying for our children? What are we choosing?
I'm afraid of what we're choosing.
Yeah, me too.
I don't have children. Michelle and I have had that conversation on and off, and have decided at this point it's not something that we're pursuing. And part of our struggle has been around the choices that we make, but really that the world makes, and that we struggle with that, and that we are. And I'm not saying that it's unfaithful to do that, especially to the parents of a 1-year-old. I think you did a great job.
No. Listen,
super cute, but
I'm not going to lie to you. Like, we had those same conversations, and I know other people that also are choosing not to have children for the same reason. Like
right.
I just really had that, like, the most like comical, that woman thing that I can't get over, where my body just like needed to have a child. It's the most disgusting thing, and it was also very true for me. And
that's awesome though. Like, that's so great.
Yeah. So
that's, but anyway,
but it still is to think about, like, what can I tell you that just like so I get just like the CNN 5 things you need to know today thing, and just my quick news, and it was sometime last week, the very first thing, it was like, scientists are now saying, and it had to do about like natural disasters are directly related to consumption, and the climate change is due to all this. I'm like, what do you mean scientists are now saying that? They've been saying that. I knew that a long time ago. Is this the problem, that people don't know that that's been a problem for a while? One of my favorite books about it came out in, like, I don't know, 2011. So it's at least over a decade old. I don't understand how we're still, the people don't know about this yet. But then you have people like my father who, thinks it's a conspiracy. And I think that's part of the problem that we have to wrestle with and figure out what to do, because I think that the hard part, and the part that at least I struggle with, and that I know I do know others that struggle with, this idea that, like, I can do everything right. I can do these things that God is asking. I can follow all of them. But the fact that this is a collective thing, how do I wrestle with the people who actively don't?
Right.
The people that aren't actively choosing life. How do we get this life thing for everyone if we can't get everyone on board? Just to throw out another one of those big questions that I think people have to wrestle with a little bit. Yeah,
that's again, thank you for inviting me to such a low-key podcast conversation. I'm always struck at the ways in which the logic that we want also becomes so obviously unhelpful. Yeah. Because wanting the black and white, yes or no, blessings and curses thing, like, go and try to shame someone who's not opting into life to find their way into making good decisions for life, right? Like, that just doesn't work. There's nothing helpful with that. It's weird that, like, people actually don't want the thing that we think that we want. But that's the bigger problem, is, like, we know that doesn't work, but we don't know what does work. So we often try that anyway. We still try to punish or shame our way into making different decisions. And that just leads to more dysfunction. And it proves to people falsely, but it proves to them that, see, this is why the system is rigged against me. So why would I change my behavior? The system's rigged against me. Even when it's not my fault, you're mad at me. Yeah. So why would I try anything different at this point? Like, well, that's actually, you're right. That's a pretty screwed up way to view the world.
It is. And I think that's what leaves, this definitely in the country we live in, though echoed in a lot of other places around the world, this driving wedge that's just, creating this well of, despair that's getting deeper and deeper and deeper as, we continue, I think, to get farther and farther away from one another in our political sphere, to the point that, like, I know recently, like, if I even try to listen to some politicians have a conversation, it's very clear they're not even talking about the same thing. Yeah. They're just so hell-bent on arguing with one another that if you're actually listening to them, they're having two totally different conversations. And I think that is very much echoed in all parts of our society too. Like even down to like when we talk about, how different Christians can have such very, very vastly different philosophies, beliefs, mindsets, humanity. Comes down to that we're just not even having the same conversations.
If you are a religious leader of any kind listening to this podcast, I think my largest encouragement for you would be to reflect on this question. Are you a part of a conversation that your congregation actually wants to be having? Because it could be that you are one end of that political discussion on TV talking about what you think is necessary, and your congregation's just not on that wavelength. I say that as a elder millennial here on a campus full of Gen Z folks, and I realize all the time that I'm having the wrong conversation, and I get brought back into it to the right one because they are willing to shepherd me, thankfully. But that's one of the challenges, is we're often trained to be dispensers of information rather than participators in conversation. And so we need to be committed to the participation rather than just simply sharing wisdom from on high.
Yes. And that's a big difference of conversation too. Change. It's, oh man, I think I can mostly quote it, but it's a good quote from Martin Luther on the freedom of a Christian, which goes great with the topic we're having today. And that change done to anyone without conversation is actually an act of violence against that person. That until it's only through conversation and relationship and being brought in can anybody actually change. That's pretty close.
Wow. Luther, like, he said some really bad things, some awful things. But every once in a while, he just really hits the truth on the head. You're like, man, he knew it.
I'm gonna look up another one because there is another good quote that I have. Yes, Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in his book Dignity and Difference defines conversation as conversation, not mere debate, but the disciplined act of communicating, making my views intelligible to someone who does not share them, and listening, entering into the inner world of someone whose views are opposed to my own. In a debate, one side wins and the other loses, but both are the same as they were before. In a conversation, neither side loses and both are changed because now they know what reality looks like from a different perspective. I think that this does really sit also with what we say about relationships, right? And what it means in the continual defining and honing and new ways that God presents relationship to us. And I think that that's another thing that's happening here is God is presenting a relationship, right? Is saying like, hey, this is what this is. This is what I would like to be in relationship with you in this way. Love, observing God's mitzvot. So this way of living and existing in the world. That this, and I will bless you, that this is a continuation of that. This is what this relationship looks like. And, it's happening. I think it's, that like what's interesting to me, especially in these Old Testament, in a lot of the Old Testament books, is we get this sort of personification of God where God speaks. And I think that that's a key piece for us to take into consideration, right? Of this understanding of like, God is in relationship, God is in conversation with us, that it's not just a top down telling you what to do kind of thing. Right. And I think that that's a key piece to being invited into life.
Yeah.
And when we invite others to be a part of that, what that looks like.
The beauty in the midst of the difficulty of this passage and in the midst of the difficulty, a lot of the Bible, I think the beauty that continually shines through for me is that God desires blessing in conversation. Like God desires blessing in community. Mm-hmm. And so I think that's mediated through lots of different perspectives. And so you're going to hear that differently in Deuteronomy than you are in Isaiah, than you are in Matthew, than you are in Romans.
Job.
And Job. Lamentations, right? Like there's all sorts of things that are out there. But the beauty of it all, and I don't want to, again, philosophy notwithstanding, I think God is willing to adapt with us. I think God is willing to change with us. The evidence of the church is absolutely that God is willing to change with us.
Yeah.
The evidence of Israel, the evidence of moving from slavery in Egypt.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so that desire to bless us in conversation goes back to exactly what Rabbi Sachs said, that God's entering a conversation where everyone's going to win, where no one loses, and we all leave changed.
Yeah.
And that's what God wants out of us, not just doing the things that he said to do and doing the things that she said not to do, not doing the things she said not to do.
And that's the life-giving piece. Yeah. Well, thank you, Drew, for being a part of this just fantastic conversation. Asking some of the really hard questions. I actually think this is one of the biggest, I think, gifts that we're invited into in our faith with God is to be able to wrestle and ask hard questions, and to sit with that. And I think that is a conversation that we have with God and being able to do that. So thank you for joining us in that. So I appreciate that. Just, updates, just, for those that haven't checked us out yet, you can check out our website at 10footpolepodcast.com and find us on Facebook and Instagram at 10footpole podcast. The website has resources. We'll add some of these stuff to it, as well as some fun merchandise. Blog posts are going to be slowly coming in, and just other access to the podcast. Thanks so much for joining us. And as I like to say, and also as I appreciate Pastor Drew saying, share this podcast with folks that, just need something to listen to on their way to work. Maybe you're wrestling with their own theology, with their own faith in the Bible right now, that hopefully, listening to some of these more in-depth conversations can be really helpful in their faith journey. So please share it. And remember that the 10-Foot Pole podcast is a ministry of the Delaware Maryland Synod. To learn more, go to demdsynod.org. Take care, everyone.